Hello and welcome to the Private Capital Podcast. I'm Joe Riley, head of Circulus Group, a network for family offices based in Greenwich, Connecticut. Our next Family Office Summit is on November 20th in New York, and it will feature Jose Minaya, head of investments at BNY, and former podcast guest Ken Kencel, president and CEO of Churchill Asset Management. Please subscribe at circulus.substack.com to stay in the loop. Roger Ferguson, the former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, has had a compelling professional and intellectual career. In our candid and wide-ranging interview, we will talk about the valuable lessons that he learned from his father and Paul Volcker, his learning economics during the 1970s inflation, unrest in Chile, and coal strikes in the UK. We also learn about Greenspan's thought processes, the concept of Fed speak, and Roger's essential moves on the morning of 9/11. Additionally, we gain insights into the last mile of inflation and the bursting of asset bubbles. I don't know if I've ever covered so much ground in a single interview, and I know you will enjoy it. Roger Ferguson Jr. is the executive chairman of Andalusian Credit Partners. Mr. Ferguson served as the 17th vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the United States Federal Reserve System from 1999 to 2006. And as a member of the Board of Governors since 1997. After leaving the Federal Reserve, Mr. Ferguson served as the president and CEO of TIAA, a $1.4 trillion asset manager from 2008 to 2021. Mr. Ferguson has been a member of the Board of Directors of Alphabet since 2016. Mr. Ferguson is currently the Stephen A. Tannenbaum Distinguished Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Roger holds a BA in economics, a PhD in economics, where one of his advisors was Michael Porter, and a JD, all from Harvard University. Please enjoy my conversation with Roger Ferguson.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Anything said by the guests or host should not be construed as legal or investment advice. Thanks for listening.
And so I wanted to start with Roger Ferguson Sr. Seems like he was quite a man. I don't remember many fathers in my neighborhood talking about interest rates at the kitchen table. So Tell me a little bit about your father.
So my father was, as you suggest, a little different from other fathers in one particular way, which is he had grown up during the Depression. And the Depression, by definition, had to be traumatic for everyone who grew up in that period. But for him, it got him very interested in banks, markets, investing more broadly. He had very little money growing up, and he had very little money as an adult. That didn't stop him from being very curious about this range of topics. And so I remember much of our conversation at the kitchen table was around banks and how safe banks were, and the CD rate that one bank would be offering for $500, $1,000, whatever it was. And I don't think he ever had more than $2,000 to move around, but he touched that $2,000 as well over $2 million. And my younger brother recalls my father going to the bank every day. It became an important part of himself. And it was not just something he did to make a little bit of money, but I think he was just completely fascinated with what was going on in banks. And so consequently, I grew up in a house where we had what is now called financial literacy at the table. This whole concept of investing, even if you had very little money, and thinking about banks and thinking about bank capital, even if you had no ownership interest in a bank, all seemed like perfectly reasonable things to do. Now I would say it's only in hindsight that I realize what an unusual person he was, because he seemed mainly like just a regular dad, and we didn't have much money, so we'd do things like go bowling or flying a kite. And he was a very active father for his time, the 50s and 60s. But this other angle only in the last several years has become very apparent to me as to, one, how different it was, and then obviously given how my career unfolded, how ingrained that kind of activity was in me at a very young age.
Did he get a chance to see you join the Fed?
Sadly, he did not. He died the year before, early in the year that I was nominated. But he got to see a great deal more. What was very interesting was there are many ways in which he was very unsophisticated. So when I gave up being a lawyer and decided I wanted to be a consultant, he and my mother were particularly worried about it because their idea of a consultant was a guy who would knock on the door at a small business and offer to look at their books and try to help them out. He really helped me in many ways. There are clearly things that he was not as attuned to as I currently am.
But that is, of course, what McKinsey does.
Yeah, absolutely. It's knock on very big doors for very big stores.
Did he have any particular point of view on the banking system, any particular strong beliefs about the risks that they took or from his experience in the Depression?
I think he certainly knew that they could be fragile, obviously. But I think more interesting to him was they were a process for making money if you did it very well. And it was the bank as a repository of limited savings, but hopefully would be very safe and secure to get your savings back. I think that was the thing that really got him very focused on banks per se, as opposed to financial stability as we call it today. That was not his interest. His interest was really more, as I save a penny, I save $1, save $500, you figure out a good bank, you put it in, and then you watch it from quarter to see who's giving the best rates. So he's also very interested in small movements in interest rates that he could try to take advantage of. I don't recall him ever doing something that one could have done, which is open bank accounts to get free toasters. That he never did, even though that was part of what one did in the 50s. But certainly moving things around to get an extra 10 basis points was in his nature.
So he entered Harvard in 1969. I'm assuming that was after the University Hall takeover?
Yeah, the University Hall takeover had been the year before, but 69 proved to be a very fraught year as well, because that spring Nixon or the U.S. invaded Cambodia. And so we actually had a strike that was university-wide, divided the faculty perhaps to some degree, but they ended up closing down the school early and sending everybody home and no final exams. In fact, I was at Harvard College for 4 years, obviously, and every spring we had some sort of strike. So there was a residual of activism, not of the University Hall takeover type, but activism continued but gradually waned. And then the normality of the late 60s going into the 70s, when people started to become pre-professional again, was the kind of Harvard that I went to. So I started with people running the streets and throwing rocks at Cambridge police officers, and ended with everybody wanting to go to Wall Street. And so it was a very interesting time to try to maintain a certain kind of equanimity.
You were there for almost the bookended the 70s in the economics departments especially. I'd be very curious to know. It was an interesting department. It probably went through more change in that decade than it has since. And there was a cast of characters there. There was Ken Galbraith, Keynesian. I think the chair was more of a monetarist. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious as to what the character of the department was like when it started and how it changed and how that affected you.
Yeah, the economics department was exactly as you point out. It was certainly one of the 2 or 3 best departments. There was always a lot of competition between Harvard and MIT, and for the reputation for being the absolute best department. And so that was one of the things that was actually going on. You could see a certain amount of ferment there around who gets tenured and et cetera that you point out. But as you also point out, there are a number of cross currents in economics that were taking place at the time. And so Ken Galbraith was widely recognized, but more as a political economist and public intellectual than actually driving the day-to-day of the economics department. So he was probably much better known for his activity in the Kennedy administration and some of his more popular books, as opposed to driving what was being taught in this department. The folks who were driving what was being taught in the department were much more sort of traditional Keynesians, for sure. And there was quite a distinction between Harvard/MIT with Samuelson, hotbed of Keynesianism, versus what was being taught at the University of Chicago. The other thing that was happening at Harvard, though, that was really interesting is this whole rise of radical political economy. So during the time I was there was a tenured faculty, Steve Margolin was his name, who was heavily influenced by some of the junior faculty, a guy named Samuel Bowles and Art McEwen and a few others, who were then taking the department to some degree to the left and creating a whole critique around even Keynesian economics, or more importantly, the way capitalism was working. And so that was also very much in the air. And actually, the other thing that was really in the air that was interesting, I mentioned the name Otto Eckstein. At that point, he was also starting DRI. And so another exciting thing that was going on was this notion of economics interfacing in a for-profit way with not just policymakers, which many of them were doing, but also with business and the creation of this whole notion of economic modeling and that driving the way investment is done, but also the way the world thinks about things. So the Harvard Economics Department, as I think about it in hindsight, had 4 or 5 different threads that were just starting there that continued to blossom and expand as well. And the final thing, obviously, was particularly most famously during the Kennedy years when I wasn't there, but it continued going forward, was the rise of Harvard economists as advisors to presidents. And this whole notion that Harvard faculty would rotate through the CEA position, Council of Economic Advisors, and then come back. And some of that was occurring while I was there as well. So there is a great deal going on, both in terms of intellectual schools of thought, but also in terms of economists and the interface with business through the advisory activity, call it DRI, and the interface between economists and policymakers. And all of those things influenced my thinking about what one could do with an economics degree, because certainly one could stay and become a faculty member somewhere. But as I was growing up professionally, it became pretty clear that an economics degree could be a door opener to many different kinds of doors. And it turns out, as I look back on my career, that's a bit of what happened. I used my economics degree to think about consulting, to think about policy making.
You did your college thesis on the situation in Chile, and you actually spent some time down there.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if what you saw in 1972 affected your later view of economics.
Yeah, so you're right. You've done great research. My college thesis was creatively named, I think, Unemployment in Chile. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure that I had the skills to analyze the situation. But I spoke Spanish reasonably well. Harvard was kind enough to give me some money so I didn't have to work during the summer, which was awfully important. I was a scholarship student. And as I think about it, to the chagrin of my parents, I went off to Chile all by myself. Had no place to stay, hotel room, and had to rent a room. But what I saw was really fascinating. It was basically the beginning, the end of the Allende regime. A year after I left, almost to the day, Pinochet overthrew Allende in a very bloody coup. But you could see the impact of economics on people's day-to-day lives. It had been widely perceived to be one of the most civilized countries in Latin America. They were known as the British of South America and took themselves very seriously about being very civilized. They had a free election, and Allende came in. He was clearly a little bit of a leftist, and he moved further and further to the left. And all of a sudden, people who are middle income, or the ones I mainly saw, and students were really torn apart. Culturally, socially. I recall this restaurant where I used to eat would have meat only 1 or 2 days a week, and we were waiting for Chinese pork to be imported, and big excitement when the pork imports came in. There were concerns about exactly how people would make money. And I found a room in the apartment of this very, to me, upper class woman who was clearly trying to make ends meet by renting out rooms in her apartment, which you would never have thought about doing until the bad times hit. And one can just keep telling these kinds of stories. And so it just became very clear that stressful economic policy, bad economic policy, can lead an otherwise really civilized country to start to fray. And Chile frayed in the worst possible way, going from having a free election to having a coup, going from a person who was, I think, started life being moderately left-wing. Allende was a doctor and ended up having a right-wing dictatorship, and going from a place where it wasn't a diverse society racially, but certainly a cohesive society, and then it became a very diverse and divided society politically. And so all of that influenced, not when I think about the right economic policy, but rather about the cost of bad economic policies, leading ultimately to the destruction of what had been a really cohesive, very much revered little nation where people treated each other with a great deal of civility, and then they went to treating each other with, obviously, a great deal of incivility. And even now, I think, trying to regain that middle ground many years later.
So the 70s were a challenging period in the U.S., obviously, the oil embargo, high inflation, high unemployment, declining manufacturing. I'm curious if this period influenced your later approach to thinking about inflation.
Remember, the 70s were exactly that, a period when inflation was getting out of control. And towards the end of my schooling, Paul Volcker started to become a more important figure. So there was no doubt that one could clearly see, as I was growing up, the impact of inflation. Couldn't see it fully because I was primarily a student. It was, without a doubt, economically a very unstable time. There was also efforts underway to control inflation without using monetary policy. Those proved to be not terribly successful, obviously.
What were those?
There was a time under Ford, and I think even before that, where it was whip inflation now, early stages of some wage price controls under Nixon, and all the other tools that a politician might think about using instead of relying on the central bank were being experimented with, not very successfully. So for sure, as I was thinking about a number of different things, one could certainly see inflation being a real drag, and worse than that, a real tax on middle class and lower middle class people. And I think only recently has that concept of inflation being on a tax of the most vulnerable, an invisible tax on the most vulnerable, has now come back into the way the world thinks about inflation. But it was very clear, particularly in the 70s, that was a problem. Also clear in the 70s was stagflation that came from the oil crisis. And so certainly one can remember long lines of cars being pushed to get a little bit of gasoline. That whole range of things was all occurring. Look, you have to remember the 70s was a period of just massive turmoil in the United States. Kids in the street, Vietnam, parents versus children, Black Power movement, and then you had all these other things happening. And obviously, during a part of it, Richard Nixon stepping down. And so for a young person growing up, reading newspapers, being at Harvard, spent 1 year in England during that period, which is also fascinating. You could see the point I was making about Allende, bad economic policy and bad economic luck, and other challenges creating a very unstable and dangerous situation. It didn't spin totally out of control. It was 70s would certainly be recalled as one of the most tumultuous and at the same time one of the most defining periods in American history, economic history and political economy history. And there I was growing up in the middle of all of that, taking it all in, so to speak.
Were you in the UK for the coal strikes?
I was in UK. I had a fellowship from Harvard for 1 year to go to any school I wanted to in England. I chose to go to Cambridge University. Did not go to King's College because I wanted to break away from economics. Went to a college where I'm still an honorary fellow called Pembroke College. And there were coal strikes during that period. And I was a young person, and what I found fascinating and I enamored of to some degree was politics that really mattered, because the left in England at that point was very much socialist. The right was the old Tory party. And so who you voted for really made a big difference in terms of the way the government worked. I always wondered why they didn't have a successful middle party, which is still, I would say, roughly the case. And then during the period that I was there was this coal miner strike. There was this guy named Arthur Scargill, who was, I think, a communist, who was leading the United Mine Workers. And he effectively brought down a labor government because he was demanding more wages and a variety of other things. And there I was again, at that point, had just graduated from Harvard College, hadn't gone back to study economics, and frankly had a year of just watching and learning and observing and taking it all in. And at the same time, there were only a handful of black people in Cambridge, as far as I can tell, and race issues were not critical to me, but there I was in a pretty isolated situation racially, didn't influence me negatively. But the other thing that I really saw was class differences. In all of the colleges, they were all male, and there were all these very upper class English young men with a certain kind of accent, and all the help had a very different kind of accent and were treated very differently. And a real sense of class existed in England then, and I think it still does, which was not certainly true in the U.S. at that time. And again, part of this whole melange of influences was becoming more and more apparent to me, so to speak.
Your next stop was at Davis Polk, which was an important time in your life. You met your wife as well as future Chairman Powell, but I'm guessing you ultimately sought a different calling.
I did. I loved Davis Polk, and as you point out, it was really important to me personally because I met my wife there. Jay Powell started the firm 4 or 5, maybe 6 months before I did, so he was technically in our class. And actually there are a number of other very strong individuals at Davis Polk at the time who moved on to do other things. Some of them went off to Goldman Sachs and ended up running really big businesses. There was a guy named Reuben Jeffrey there who ended up coming back to Washington and became the head of the CFTC. So my little generation of Davis Polk people, while it had a number of great lawyers and people did other things, what I remember about it was the number of us who veered into different directions, but all had that beginning. It was also really important to me because I'd gone to law school and I wanted to learn how to be a lawyer. I didn't know whether I wanted to be a lawyer professionally because my love was really economics. To this day, some of the training that comes from actually having been a lawyer, I think, has helped me think through some issues and I think has made me a better consumer of the law. I don't regret that 2.5 years at all, not just for the personal reasons, but professionally. It was also the place where I learned how to be a professional. Davis Polk had a very high standard of responding to your clients' needs, being a great advisor to clients. It was a time when Wall Street law firms did much more than they do today in terms of counseling work for big companies. Right now, most of that work has been taken in-house, but in my day, Davis Polk was the outside advisor to a number of major companies, as well as doing the kinds of transactional work. So it was just a wonderful time.
When you were at McKinsey, did you cover asset management?
I did financial institutions. I did one study that I had something to do with, a couple of studies that had to do with asset management businesses, trying to sort that out. I did one very interesting study with a company called Allegheny, which was putting together lots of different financial institutions, and it was becoming a sort of a very interesting financial holding company. And so I got exposure to all parts of the financial services world, not just traditional banking, but also some asset management, some financial conglomerates. And I did one study that had to do with the payments and operations part of one of the big money center banks. And so from my standpoint, McKinsey was a great way to understand much broader ambit of financial services, not just banking, not just investment banking, but some of these other things that are really important as well.
Did you work there? That was a period also of major change, with the old partnership model on the street and consolidation in banking. Did your work there affect the way you look at risk in the banking system?
When I was at McKinsey, one of the leading banking partners I had a chance to work with was a guy named Lowell Bryan. And Lowell wrote a book called Break Me Up the Bank, which was the first time anyone had thought about, at least in my awareness, the concept of good bank and bad bank. And so that was one way that I started to come to understand through reading and work with Lowell how one thinks about banks and this broader financial stability component, and how one thinks about banks that fail or could fail. And so that was, again, eye-opening, not a traditional McKinsey study, but just reading and learning from Lowell the way he thought about creating financial stability by creating this new concept of a bad bank versus a good bank, which basically would be a way to do bank workout, which I was not heavily involved in doing any of that, fortunately, during my career. But it's an important thing to understand about how one has to resolve a bank. And that's mainly the job of the FDIC and others, but that was one of the things that was certainly in the air at the time that I was working at McKinsey.
We spent a lot of time talking about talent on the podcast, and I'm curious, how does one get on the radar of the Federal Reserve? How did you source new members, new governors? What are some of the finer considerations for somebody who would be a good fit for that?
The first thing you have to understand is that the role of governor of the Fed is nominated by the president and confirmed by Congress. And what presidents look at, in my observation, fortunately, is still is primarily around technical skill. There are very few people on the Board of Governors of the Fed who are there because they were personal friends with the president. Once in a while that happens. It's unlike other agencies where it's often a reward for having helped the president get elected. The Fed tends not to be that, fortunately. Having said that, presidents also recognize that they want, particularly for the regulatory and supervisory part of the Fed, it's become more and more apparent, but even when I was there, this notion that maybe Democrats are more attuned to regulation and Republicans are thought to be more deregulatory. And so you can see some of that as well. But what's very interesting as I think about the various folks who've served on the Fed is, other than the academics, I'm not sure that most people's views on monetary policies, Dove and Hawke and that kind of thing, are particularly well known. Sometimes that's the case, but I think often presidents are surprised when they put someone on the Fed exactly how they may think about moving interest rates from one meeting to another, how they weigh inflation versus unemployment. When I was there, actually, though the Fed had the dual mandate, we always thought that the best way to handle the maximum sustainable growth part of the Fed's mandate was to keep inflation low and stable. And so that was a sort of a consistent point of view. But at the end of the day, what one looks for is technical experience, technical expertise, and the ability to make collegial decisions, because the Fed is a very collegial place. Now, not everyone is equally good at everything, and not everyone is equally good at a collegial style, but I think those are some of the things that one thinks about. And the other thing that's become more and more important with the Fed is moving away from purely academic type economists to Alan Greenspan as a Wall Street type economist. We have just a range of different people who do different kinds of economics. When I was there, one of my colleagues was Larry Meyer. He was an academic economist, but he's probably better known for his, back to this Otto Eckstein story I was telling. Larry was the chief engine behind Macroeconomic Advisors, I think it was called, one of the best forecasting outfits in the country at that time. Alan Blinder was on the board when had been on the board before I was there. Great macroeconomist, not so much a monetary policy person. He was much broader than that, and he had been appointed by Clinton. But Clinton had also appointed a woman named Alice Rivlin, who had a PhD in economics for sure, but I don't think she ever actually had a traditional academic job. She was very much a Washington economic policymaker, had been one of the first people to lead the Congressional Budget Office. I think she was very first. And what one was looking for at the Fed was a range of economic experiences and backgrounds with a certain kind of party alignment, but I would think the economic experience was in many ways more important than the party alignment.
How flexible does your thinking have to be at the Fed? Do you think those with strong beliefs are better suited to take the pressure?
I've seen really good governors of both types. Some that have a very clear model of how the economy works and stick with it. Larry Meyer is an example of that. He's a strong believer in a certain shape to the Phillips curve. He has a strong belief about the NIRA, which is the long-term stable interest rate that doesn't drive inflation one way or the other. He really has that mindset. That's the way he approached everything, and he was a very good governor for doing that. There are others who are much more agnostic in their model. Actually, Alan Greenspan, great chairman by anyone's standard, was very much a data-driven individual. That helped him pick up the first productivity wave that we had and kept interest rates lower than some of his colleagues had wanted, because he said he didn't see inflation rising, and he proved to be right on that score. Since then, Ben Bernanke came in with his strong understanding of the Great Depression and the problems, the mistakes the Fed had made. So I guess the answer to your question is knowing when and how to apply a particular model can be a great strength, and knowing when to avoid a particular model can also be a great strength. Now, the one thing I think all of these folks have in common, back to your point about pressure, is recognizing that the Fed is serving a much bigger national purpose. And the ones who have been weakest as Fed leaders have been those who have, I'm going to use the word, knuckled under to political pressure and ignored the longer term, bigger role. The icon of the Fed, obviously, is Paul Volcker, a man who famously withstood pressure from the White House, pressure from farmers, pressure from construction companies, and drove the economy, frankly, into 2 recessions in order to get rid of inflation. So that kind of fortitude is what all of us learn when we get to the board. How you exercise it, what your models might be, might vary. But in order to be a really successful policymaker, I think the most important trait that all of us have in common is this real sense that we're not serving a political goal. We're serving the American people by keeping inflation low and stable. And therefore, I believe, by allowing for maximum sustainable employment.
Do you still have the 2x4 that Paul Volcker gave you?
Yes, I do. What's funny about it is I had to put a little stamp on it. So there are stamps, and it was addressed in handwriting on the back.
Could you tell us about it?
Yeah, so so give you the whole context. I just mentioned how Paul Volcker was very brave and dealt with serious protests from the farming community, the construction community. And the way the construction protests occurred was individuals, I presume, I don't think it was organized, sent in cut off pieces of 2x4 in roughly 7-8 inches and addressed them by hand to Paul Volcker, Federal Reserve Board, Washington, D.C. You had to put a stamp on it, or a series of stamps, and they all had stamps. And on the back was basically, "Dear Mr. Volcker, stop stepping on our necks," or "Why are you screwing up the economy," or "Don't you care about jobs?" And then a lot of cursing sometimes. And he was kind enough to give me one from his drawer of these activities. It's a really big reminder about 2 things: the cost of inflation and the cost of driving inflation out of the economy. And what you learn is it's better to not have to do the second thing, because the cost of driving inflation out of the economy is recession, almost always, sometimes not. Occasionally there's a soft landing. Greenspan managed to achieve one of those, but that's the rare exception. And we've also learned, and we had learned this in the 70s, the cost of inflation itself is this secret tax, invisible tax on low and moderate income people who tend not to be able to protect themselves from inflation. And having all of that in mind whenever one goes into that building, I think, is incredibly important.
What is the prep like for a board meeting? How much information is enough or too much?
There are a number of different, so what happens is there's the Beige Book, which is the qualitative anecdotal information that's gathered up in all the different districts. There's a Teal Book, which basically is the modeling from the Federal Reserve staff, and it always has different scenarios. Look, how much information is too much when you're making a tough decision? Again, I think it varies from person to person. My buddy, whom I have a high regard for, Larry Meyer, had a series of models in his head and put data into it, and out came his sense of where we were, of this NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And that would drive his thinking. As I said, Greenspan, much more eclectic. Tell me about car train loadings and how long is the line of ships out at Long Beach, that kind of question.
What do you think he got out of that? He's famous for those very eccentric data points.
But you have to understand, he had been studying the economy on a daily basis since the mid-50s. He started Townsend Greenspan. He became the driving force behind Townsend Greenspan. Did 2 things with that kind of information. One was used it in his own mental model of how the economy worked. I also, frankly, think he used it as a little bit of create the mystique that became the maestro. He'd often have a view of where he wanted policy to go, and in hindsight now, and he was my mentor and still consider him a friend, I think occasionally he used that just to make sure he got his way in the room, to be honest with you. Nothing wrong with that. But he took it very seriously, and he would write, he's written several books and other things on, this is all of, he had a very personal and idiosyncratic way of understanding the economy. But the reason you can't criticize it is because he was right at points. He wasn't always right, let's be clear, but he was right at some points that really did matter. Because he was the first person to pick up this concept that, I don't know if he said it publicly, but said it occasionally, that the GDP of the economy is getting lighter. So he picked up the impact of technology in our economy, our ability to be much more productive. And you have to give him a lot of credit. So I think it helped him understand the economy, and at the same time, it helped him create the aura of being the maestro, is my assessment. Again, having worked with him for 7 or 8 years towards the end of his career, and now having the chance to reflect on what I learned when I was watching him work.
I'm curious how long it takes to learn Fed speak. You're put in these impossible situations where you want to give clarity, and I know you worked a lot on transparency. You want to give clarity, but you have to be very careful about the second and third order interpretations of what you're saying.
I followed the Fed closely for such a long period of time that it just seemed like the right language. And I walked in thinking, that of course you should do Fed speak, right? How long does it take? To be fair, most people who've joined the institution do have what I think I had a little bit of, which is this instinctive notion that you wanted to convey information without disturbing markets. And so consequently, choosing your words carefully, being as responsive as you can without going too far was important. Having said that, you use this phrase Fed speak. The Fed speak of the period I was in, 97 to 2006, I think is quite different from the Fed speak today. And the Fed speak today is different from what it was, this is 2025, was different from what it was 3 years ago. And the reason is this whole notion of transparency itself has evolved, but importantly, I think one of the things that they've learned is the notion of forward guidance, which Ben Bernanke cleverly and appropriately used. One has now learned the limitations of it. The notion of Fed speak as this sort of opacity, I think, is a little misguided. But because the Fed is really trying to be as transparent as it can be in the face of a great deal of uncertainty. And so during my period of watching the Fed, being on the Fed, and then again watching the Fed, it went from Paul Volcker, where Fed speak was literally shrouded in smoke, and they weren't at all clear about what they were trying to achieve. And I think Paul's framework required that because he knew he had to raise interest rates and create recessions. And I don't think he wanted to be very explicit about the cost of getting inflation out, though he knew it. Then it went to the period when I was there where we were experimenting with different kinds of transparency, while at the same time moving the markets when necessary, and I'll come back to that point. And then it's evolved towards even more transparency where we give forward guidance. They do. And now it's backed away from forward guidance because they have a great deal of ambiguity. And so, you learn Fed speak, but you have to learn your version of it. So if I were using an analogy, it's like you go from Old English to Middle English to modern day English, whatever the phraseology is. And so this concept of Fed speak, as I've been observing, is really interesting because what the markets expect and what the Fed wants to do has actually progressed quite a bit since the Volcker heyday in the 70s and 80s.
Chairman Greenspan was on a plane on the morning of 9/11 and essentially incommunicado. You were in the office and got a call from your wife about the attacks. Could you take us through your thinking that morning?
So the morning of 9/11 obviously was incredibly stressful. As you point out, my wife called me after the first plane had gone in and told me to turn on the TV, and I saw the second plane going in. The first thing that went through her mind, obviously, is this is a crisis unfolding. How big is the crisis going to be? Who knows? But the other thing that was clearly on my mind was this is a crisis of the financial sector because of the nature of where the World Trade Centers were, the financial capital of the world, Wall Street. So as I've gone to relive this, I just realized that the second plane went in to the second tower somewhere around 9 o'clock. I get the time.
9:03.
9:03. It turns out that at 9:20, I put a call in to the woman who then ran the part of the system that dealt with payment system, a woman named Louise Roseman. It turns out, was unaware of what was happening. I thought she knew exactly what was happening. And we planned a strategy that was executed with the first public statement that were made, which didn't get much attention, which was around 9:40, 9:45. We put out a statement that basically said the large dollar payment system called FedWire that we run would stay open as long as necessary to clear all trades. And so obviously, I say that to say the first thing that went through my mind was, back to somebody done at McKinsey, payment systems are going to be stressed. And if the payment system is stressed, then you don't know whether or not a check that you were expecting to cash is going to work. Consequently, you as an individual run to the bank to get money out. That occurs not just among individuals, but it occurs between banks. It occurs between companies. and the entire system can start to collapse because I don't know if you are a credit-worthy counterparty anymore. And that happens from individual to individual. I don't know if my paycheck's going to be honored, to bank the nation. And while I didn't think about it exactly in that logical way, the reason I tell you this story is I find it curious that my very first reaction was to call the person who runs payment systems and say, this is the most important thing we have to do. And that was what was obviously, I say that to say the evidence of what was going through my mind was financial stability, trust and confidence in the payment system, and more broadly, trust and confidence in the banking system. And everything else that happened during the next 3 or 4 days when Chairman Greenspan either was incommunicado or asked me to lead the Fed's response was all about creating trust and confidence in the financial system, which sounds very arcane these days, depended very much on trust and confidence in the payment system. And that the evidence shows that that was the first thing going through my mind, because the very first phone call I made within 15 or 20 minutes of witnessing this horrific thing was to the person who was responsible for that activity.
How did you keep that going during the day? They obviously evacuated all the buildings in Washington, and I'm sure they evacuated all the federal buildings in the country.
But we never evacuated the Fed. And that was a pretty easy decision to make for Washington, because I looked out, the Federal Reserve building is on Constitution Avenue. I looked out at Constitution Avenue. It was clear that no cars were moving anywhere. And so it made no sense to leave the building and go stand in traffic. So then at about 10:15, I'm going to get the times a little off, but it's in the record somewhere, we convened a call, must have been 10:30, 10:45, of all the Federal Reserve presidents. And I told them that what we're going to do is keep the system open and operating. I had dictated a statement to the head of communications that basically said two simple things. We're going to keep the Federal Reserve System open and operating. And back to the point I'd make, the payment system, we call it the discount window, is available for any liquidity needs. And so the decision to keep the system open and operating was one that I encouraged. We had some debate among the Reserve Bank presidents. Some wanted to close, some didn't. But it was pretty clear to me that we had to keep the system open and operating in order to do what we had to do on the payments activities, and in order to become, if you will, exercise our role as lender of last resort and our informal but very important role of driving financial stability by using all the tools that we had at our disposal.
You would have probably gotten lots of leeway, and being a special case, to close the window. I'm assuming that's what some folks were suggesting.
Yeah, some folks suggested, first, the president has ordered an evacuation. We should evacuate. Some of the Federal Reserve presidents were concerned their buildings would come under attack because they were close to airports and other reasons. But it was pretty clear to me that we had to keep the system open because we were central to every element of payments. And I start with just getting cash into ATMs, because whenever there's a crisis, there's almost always a run on the bank to get some money. I didn't want to have any ATM that was functioning to run out of money. And so we had this very interesting negotiation and discussion and ultimately cooperation between the Federal Reserve and the National Guard in New Jersey to bring trucks of cash in to keep the ATMs that were functioning filled with money. And that's just a prosaic example of what we had to do from bottom to top. But all of it was really about maintaining liquidity in the system, thereby maintaining confidence in the system, and thereby avoiding having a human tragedy become a case of financial instability that would have been really hard to contain.
And how did the conversation change after that? Obviously, that was an urgent situation, but the U.S. was already in a recession, and there had been loosening prior to September 17th, I think is when you folks met. I'm curious how you navigated that period afterwards, going from the immediate back to the medium term, long term.
So as you observe, on the Monday morning before markets open, we cut rates again. That was clearly to drive enough liquidity in the system to maintain stability. And our goal during much of that period was exactly the same. The U.S. fell into a short and shallow recession for sure. I think it could have been much worse. And so the theory of the case was returning to normality, but a slow return to normality of what monetary policy was supposed to do, because it was switching gradually from financial stability and helping recover from a shock to the usual range of questions about where are we versus potential growth versus inflation, et cetera. And so we had to continue to keep interest rates low for a period of time. Some people may argue for too long, in order to make sure that not only did we get things back to an even keel from a financial stability standpoint, but that also we are confronting the risk of a recession that could have gotten out of hand. And so that was the way that there was a little bit of a trade-off back from financial stability driven policy to regular monetary policy.
I know you've thought a lot about this over the years, about the last mile of inflation. And why is that, in general, the hardest to reduce? You can get inflation down from very high levels. You have levers for that. But it's that 3% to 2% that proves pretty tricky.
We certainly learned that the last mile is proven tricky. As I think about it, there are a couple of things that make it difficult. One is there's still some inflationary pressures that remain from the legacy of inflation. And so if you are a worker or you are a household or you are an owner of capital, one of the things that's in your mind is, oh, inflation has existed. I thought it was gone away. Most people haven't actually seen periods of inflation in this country in the last 40 years. And so it doesn't factor into your thinking whatsoever. But once it emerges, then I think it factors in a pretty large way in most people's thinking, particularly for the inflation that we just had, which was a dramatic move up to roughly 9% after a period in which inflation had gotten up to 1.5%, not quite 2%, to suddenly have it be 9%. It's on people's minds. It's what's being talked about. It drove in the U.S. an election. And it's hard to get people to forget about that. And I say it's a little bit like telling people don't think about blue elephants. Once you say blue elephants, what do? People tend to think about blue elephants. And once you've had a bout of inflation, people tend to think about inflation. It takes a long time for it to go away. And I saw that certainly in Latin America. We don't have indexing the way they had in Brazil, but people do a mental kind of indexing, even if we don't have official indexing. And they're very slow to not want to be rewarded for the risk of inflation. And so I think that's one of the challenges that makes it so hard to get it down from very high numbers to lower numbers. The other thing is most policymakers recognize their tool is pretty blunt. And I think what happens to many people is, how comfortable am I driving the economy to a recession to get that last bit of inflation out of the system? And I think that's a little bit of a new psychology that people deal with, because Paul Volcker believed that the only acceptable level of inflation was 0. He told me that, he told many people that, it's not a secret. And if your view is that the only acceptable level of inflation is 0, then you will drive it down to get to 0, and Paul showed that he was willing to risk recession to really get it back to 0. If you have a view that a small amount of inflation is okay, and we think 2% is roughly the right number, once you get close to 2%, particularly if you've had the experience of bringing inflation down from very high numbers to something close to 2%, I think the psychology of most people is, I can't really fine tune it. Am I ready to hold rates high enough to get it just to 2, and what happens if it goes below? And because we've had experience in central banking with disinflation and deflation as well. So it's a long way of saying I think there's something goes on even with the best intentioned policymakers, that the cost of that last 1% inflation may be a hard one to swallow. And I just think that's the way human nature has started to emerge. I don't know if that's constructive or not constructive. I certainly don't want to have anyone think that the Fed is not firmly committed to the 2% target, because they clearly are. The process of getting it from here to there is a challenging one. And there's this concept that exists in central banking of opportunistic disinflation, which is you drive inflation down as far as you can with your tools and then take advantage of every other moment that may come along to push it down a little further. But to some degree, you have to wait for those moments to come. And I think there's a little bit of that goes through people's minds as you get closer and closer to the 2% target.
I was rereading Sebastian Mallaby's excellent biography of Chairman Greenspan. My impression was the chairman thought it was easier to clean up after a bubble than to pop it or even know if you were in a bubble. Do you think that's an accurate representation of the chairman's thinking?
Look, Sebastian spent a lot of time talking to the chairman, and I think his book is an accurate reflection of what Chairman Greenspan thinks or thought at the time. And my observation is roughly the same. He famously went out and asked a question about irrational exuberance, showing that he is clearly aware that bubbles could exist, but the knowledge of whether or not a bubble did exist is a very hard thing to know. And then the decision to, again, throw the economy into reverse to prick what you think might be a bubble is a big question. And recognize that a bubble means that an asset class, or maybe more than one, is mispricing risk somehow. But because financial actors are mispricing risk, is that a reason why you should throw the average American into a situation where perhaps unemployment goes up unnecessarily? And so I think that's one of the dilemmas that people confront. Even if you never know for sure if there's a bubble, you don't know if it is going to burst or is it going to, the air gradually be let out of the balloon. But you do know for sure that if you decided to attack the bubble, the cost to the rest of the economy could also be very large. And so one has to really make that trade-off. And I think that may have been part of what Chairman Greenspan's thought process might have been, back to this notion that Sebastian reports, of his notion it's easier to clean up after a bubble than to prick one, because the collateral damage across lots of innocent people, because some financial actors are mispricing risk, it's got to be considered. I have judged that the price of these X stocks is too high. Therefore, I'm going to throw the entire economy into a recession. It's quite different from, asset price inflation is quite different from inflation. Inflation, as I said 5 times now, tax on innocent people. Asset price inflation is a mispricing of a particular good, service in the economy, but it's not the entire economy having this general rise of interest rates. No one likes asset price inflation. Is the harm to asset price inflation more or less than the harm of fixing it? We know the harm of general inflation is great. It throws economies off, it throws societies off if it gets out of hand. Think about hyperinflation, et cetera. And therefore Congress says keep inflation under control. Congress does not tell the Fed, by the way, adjust asset prices if you happen to think that they look a little frothy to you. It's not in the mandate. It's not specific in the mandate. And so when people say, oh, you should act against asset price inflation, I say make sure you know what you're asking for, because you're asking a bunch of unelected individuals to override markets, which are imperfect and can get out of kilter, but to use a very blunt tool to do that, which is basically the cost of money for everybody, which can slow things down quite dramatically. And by the way, that tool itself, as I said, is very blunt. And so getting it to achieve the soft landing, as we know, is really tricky.
You brought TIAA into the $1 trillion club, but before we get to that, maybe we could talk about what the firm was like when you got there. It was a large and old institution, but it was in a very competitive environment. How did you see the industry at that moment and where you wanted to go?
So you're right. When I joined TIAA, or TIAA-CREF, as it was then called, in 2008, there are 2 things going on. One was chronic and one was acute. So what do I mean by that? What was acute during 2008 obviously was the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. I had joined TIAA from Swiss Re, which was one of the first, maybe even the first big financial institution to have had losses because of subprime. And as I was joining, I was thinking, there's something going on in this space. I'm not quite sure what it is, but the subprime stuff had caused a $2 billion loss at Swiss Re. I happen to have been the head of asset management there. And everybody had some subprime in their portfolio because it was AAA fixed income. So the first thing we had to do was to de-risk the TI portfolio, and the risk team was all over it. They had probably imagined the issues even before I got there. And we also had to start to think about how we're going to reduce costs to keep things in balance. Or very early on in my tenure at TI, it was really crisis management. That was the thing that was acute. To your question, what was chronic? The TIAA was a big, very conservative, very solidly run retirement company confronting a demographic shift that we modeled would have led to a pretty dramatic runoff over a long period of time of the assets in the company. And in insurance speak, there's this thing called runoff, where your company starts to gradually shrink and then at some point potentially becomes unviable. And so the bigger chronic problem was to think about how do we make sure that we can keep all of our commitments to people who are saving with us about providing retirement, and that effectively meant how do we diversify the revenue stream here so that we're not totally committed or reliant upon the asset flows that come from retirement, but use some of our skills to generate revenue in other ways. And so out of that came the strategy that we developed, that we would leverage our investment prowess and make TIA not just a great retirement company, which it is, but make it a great asset management business, which it has become. And so my tenure from 2008 to 2021 was around doing both things, maintaining our strength in retirement and diversifying revenue by making us a really great asset management business. And I think in hindsight, both those things seem to have worked out pretty well.
What was the logic of the Nuveen acquisition?
As I said, our strategy was to become a big asset management business. We have a very good in-house asset management team, but what I discovered was that the ability to build assets using for third parties, not just retirement people, but others, was a very slow process to do organically. And so we started to do that inorganically by doing acquisitions. And we did a number of them during the time I was there, I think roughly 10 or 12, either startups or acquisitions in the asset management space. And so we started small with an acquisition in the ag business and then the timber business. And then we bought the European real estate capabilities of Henderson, which was a big UK-based asset management business. And then the third or fourth or fifth acquisition was the Nuveen acquisition. But that was in a pattern of building third-party asset managers, some of which were much smaller, as I pointed out, and then the real estate one. So that was the logic of Nuveen. I was looking for a good third-party asset manager that had a great brand that was differentiated from the usual buy and hold, long-only equity shop where we had seen runoff, and that could complement the things that we knew about. And Nuveen, phenomenal brand, great in a specialty area called municipal bonds, which is a huge market, complements very well the long liability side of a retirement company. And we could build around that a number of other activities. And so Nuveen was the largest of those acquisitions and became the brand that the company is now using to help drive its third-party asset management business.
So tell us a little bit about what you're up to now, Andalusian. I understand David Tepper was a seed investor in the firm.
So I'm doing a number of things now, but they all are in the mode of asset management, basically asset management boutiques that are growing, I hope, over time, with me as part of it. So one of the things I am doing is Andalusian Credit Partners. It is a private credit shop. Yes, David Tepper was one of the early investors, but he's very much not actively engaged day to day. And the company's been growing quite nicely. We have now roughly $1 billion and then if you would leverage on it, it means that we can put to work roughly $1.5 billion. To be fair, in that industry, relatively small, given the $2 trillion that are flowing into private credit. But what I like about them, and the reason I'm associated with it, is it's very focused in a number of areas I think others overlook. Heavy lean towards what's called non-sponsored deals, which means lending directly to the company, not lending to a PE firm that then wants to use that leverage in its PE investments in the company. Our focus tends to be on middle market, which are areas that the bigger PE private credit firms aren't very interested in. Requires really good underwriting skill. And the focus tends to be in sports, where we have some capability and access, but sports adjacencies, not teams. And then, given my background, financial services, and then other kinds of specialty services. So I'm very excited about it. And I would say The other great thing is this is a brand new enterprise. And so unlike some other firms, we don't have a lot of legacy loans that were put on the books when maybe terms are a little easier. We're putting on new terms at current market conditions where I think we're getting paid appropriately for the risk that we're taking.
Roger Ferguson, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your wonderful insights.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or share it with your friends. Thank you.